Greetings to Father Joe Champlain and parishioners of Assumption Church. My name is Father Joe Cheah. What I want to do today is talk about anti-Asian racism. Why is anti-Asian race violence on the rise? And what do the Church's teaching on racism have to say about it? With regard to the Church's teaching on racism, there are two documents issued by the same group of bishops, USCCB, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, in 2018. And the first document is called Open Wide Our Hearts. That's the pastoral letter. And on the left is the Encountering Christ in Harmony. It's the pastoral response. They were both issued in 2018. Open Wide Our Hearts is an improvement over previous pastoral statements in its acknowledgement of the Church's complicity in evil of racism. But as a pastoral letter against racism, it has rendered the struggles and racialized experiences of Asian American and Pacific Islanders completely invisible. Open Wide Our Hearts covers historical violence against Native Americans, African Americans, and those of Hispanic descent, but not that of the AAPI, or Asian American and Pacific Islanders. Like most Americans before the pandemic, the bishops in the United States, who are overwhelmingly white, probably did not think Asian Americans suffer from violent racism. And that's probably the reason why the experience of Asian American is not in the pastoral letter. The other document, Encountering Christ in Harmony, focuses on Asian and Pacific Islanders in terms of their identity, generations, leadership, cultural encounter, and dialogue in faith. It discusses racism experienced by the AAPI population in slightly over a page, which is wholly inadequate. Neither document prepares us to understand the experiences of the AAPI population, but the pastoral letter against racism contains certain themes such as respect for the dignity of the human person, biblical notion of justice, and so on, that will provide helpful theological and scriptural frameworks in responding to issues of injustice faced by AAPI population today. The first question, why is anti-Asian violence on the rise? Anti-Asian hate, racism, and violence are not new. They are deeply rooted in American history. Even before the first group of Asians arrived in significant number, the American public already had a negative view of Chinese as opium addicts, depraved heathens, as well as carriers of disease and contagions. And this is the example of yellow peril, a racialized stereotype of an unassimilable aliens who were unfair competitors, susceptible to contagions and a threat to the Western way of life. Initially, Chinese immigrants came in notable numbers to search for gold in California. Later, they were recruited to build the western portion of the Transcontinental Railway. Destitute and uneducated laborers from China were forced to live in overcrowded urban areas called Chinatowns, which became associated with filth and immorality, a physical and moral threat to public health and welfare. Those who came to the U.S. were mainly young Chinese men because America wanted Chinese labor, but not the Chinese themselves. To ensure that the Chinese would not populate California, it was very difficult for Chinese women to immigrate to the U.S. in the 19th century. In Strangers from a Different Shore, Asian American historian Ron Takaki provides us with some lopsided statistic. In 1852, for every Chinese woman in the U.S., there were 1,685 Chinese men. By 1870, the ratio of Chinese women to men improved dramatically to 14 to 1. However, many of these Chinese women were brought to the U.S. by large syndicates as sex slaves. In 1875, Congress passed the Page Act, which prohibited prostitutes from entering the country. The target of the Page Act was Chinese women who were suspected of prostitution. In Minor Feelings, an Asian American Reckoning, Kathy Park Hong, a poet, a cultural critic, and professor, did not mince words when she graphically described the life of a Chinese prostitute. And I'm citing from the screen here. I cannot fathom being a 15-year-old girl from China, abducted and smuggled to this wild, barbaric country, locked in a boarding house to be raped 10 times a day until her body was hollowed out by syphilis. After that, she was dumped out on the street to die alone. As a bachelor society, early Chinatown reflected the common vices of the society, which included a thriving vice economy based on gambling, prostitution, and drugs. So it did not bode well for the Chinese migrants when sensational print media portraying Chinatown as breeding grounds of disease, depravity, and degradation found widespread acceptance with the American populace. As the Chinese population grew in California, so did xenophobia and racism direct towards them. They were racialized as dog eaters and associated with other vermin like rats and mice. During the outbreak of smallpox in 1875 to 76, San Francisco officials blamed the Chinese Chinatown for unsanitary living conditions that endanger public health. This was also the case when bubonic plague struck in 1900. As xenophobic propaganda depicting Chinese as disease-ridden, depraved heathens and unassimilable to the American way of life spread throughout the country, they became an easy scapegoat for the widespread violence against them. Prior to 1882, the United States had free immigration. Only 3 groups were excluded from coming here, and they were lepers, prostitutes, and mentally challenged individuals. In 1882, Chinese were added to the list. It marked the first time in U.S. history that a federal law prohibited a group of people from entering the country on the basis of race. The Irish and the Chinese had similar immigration characteristics in that they both came to the United States in sizable number about the same time, and they both were persecuted for their religion and race. After the Civil War, which is around 1861 to 65, many Irish immigrant laborers flooded into the state of California with the hope that they would find a new beginning in the West. And after the completion of the Transcontinental Railway in 1869, many Chinese workers settled in Chinatowns on the West Coast, and about 24% of California's Chinese population resided in San Francisco. This led to a competition for jobs between Chinese workers and Irish immigrant laborers, which became increasingly acrimonious during the period of economic depression, which runs from 1873 to 79. The Chinese workers were blamed for competing unfairly with white workers, taking jobs from them, even though venture capitalists recruited Chinese who work harder and for less, and used them to keep the wages down. In other words, the notion that of the action of the capitalists pitted the white workers against the Chinese, who were blamed for working for low wages and thereby bringing down the standard of living of white Americans. Instead of challenging the capitalists of playing the race card, xenophobic racism of unemployed white workers reared its ugly head as it turned into violent racist attacks against Chinese workers who were seen as a threat, a yellow peril, unassimilable aliens who brought economic competition, disease, and depravity. The Irish, who were seen as neither fully white nor fully Christian by the native whites, began to scapegoat the Chinese as racial and religious others. This was like the pot calling the kettle black. With the rise of anti-Chinese movement in the early 1880s, the construction of Chinese as common danger for both the Irish Catholics and the native white Protestant offered the opportunity for Irish Catholics to side with the white Christian patriotism and thereby becoming white. A notorious proponent of anti-Chinese exclusion, an agitator for the white working class during the Depression of the 1870s, was the immigrant Irishman named Dennis Kearney. He exploited the economic insecurity of the working class by delivering scathing speeches denouncing business capitalists and the presence of Chinese in California. On September 21, 1877, Kearney and several others established the Workingmen's Party of California, or WPC, to advocate for fair wages for white workers and to rid the country of cheap Chinese labor. Kearney despised the Chinese and resorted to popular racist sentiments to justify the exclusion of Chinese immigrants. He peppered his incendiary speeches with anti-Chinese invective of the day, for example, leprous, rat-eating Chinese slaves, and ended his speeches with the cry, "The Chinese must go." Almost all of the Chinese were manual laborers with little or no education. There were a few exceptions, and one of them was Wang Qingfu, a civil rights activist dedicated his life to advocate for equal rights of Chinese in the United States. The first to use the label Chinese American, Wang urged Chinese immigrants to become Americanized and fight for their rights as American citizens. He testified before a congressional committee to repeal Citizenship Denied the Chinese and to oppose renewal of Chinese Exclusion Act. When the Chinese Exclusion Act was about to pass for the second time in 1892, and Congressman Thomas Geary argued for renewing this act by imposing new restriction, Wang established the Chinese Equal Rights League, an organization whose purpose was to fight for the civil rights of Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans. When the Geary Act was passed to extend exclusion of Chinese for another 10 years, Wang mobilized tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants to protest against discriminatory legislation. That's not too easy to do. This is one of the things that probably not in U.S. history. Now you're talking about one of the most, one of the first massive civil disobedience cases in U.S. history, and it was done by a Chinese American named Wang Qingfu. In the U.S. history, they would like to depict Asian American as somebody who's servile, obsequious, somebody who don't rock the boat. That's a general depiction. They don't show them as people who are fighting for the rights. And Wang Qingfu was one of the biggie. The author of this book, Scott Seligman, puts it this way: Wang challenged Americans to live up to the principle they freely espouse, but failed to apply the Chinese in their midst. The underlying objective of Kearney's WPC, in retrospect, was not simply to advocate for fair wages for white workers, but for Irish to become part of the dominant white ethnic group. To do this, they had to adopt a white supremacist ideology by displaying nativist racism toward the Chinese. In California, Kearney and the members of the WPC identified themselves as patriotic white Christian and sought to keep the state of California white by presenting the Chinese workers or persecuting Chinese workers for their race, culture, and personal hygiene. Given the opportunity to start a new beginning in the West by joining the elite white racial group that they had not been allowed to do so in the East, it's not surprising that among the strongest supporters of the Chinese Exclusion Act were the Irish. They did everything in their power because they have Irish can vote. They had the right to vote. The Chinese could not vote because Chinese could not be a citizen of the United States. So the Irish did everything in their power to ensure that the Chinese were barred from entering the United States. For the Irish Catholic, America is for Americans. To put it another way, America is a white man's country. In other words, Irish immigrants were persecuted for the Catholic faith and racialized as biologically inferior to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant on the East Coast, recognized in California that the physical whiteness was more salient when juxtaposed next to the Chinese. Instead of living out their Catholic faith, the Irish took on the mental whiteness to treat the Chinese just as badly as they themselves were treated by the native whites on the East Coast. The Irish became white by being racist toward the Chinese on the West Coast and actively discriminating against African Americans on the East Coast. On the East Coast, the Irish separate themselves from their black counterparts in the adoption of racist view toward them and by opposing the abolitionist movement. Although the Irish immigrants were seen as inferior race to native whites, Irish Americans knew that they could pass white and can pursue the American dream even if that required them to deny the same dream to blacks and the Chinese. This is a sad commentary often repeated in American history about how the oppressed became the oppressor. This raises a more disturbing question about whether an acceptance of an ideology of white supremacy is a necessary condition for becoming American. The second factor that I want to look at for the rise of anti-Asian violence has to do with former President Donald Trump. He tapped into the hate sentiment in our society, deeply rooted in part in the history that I just went over, and normalized it by routinely scapegoating China and Chinese people for spreading the coronavirus. His insistent and repetitive usage of ethnic slur like Chinese virus, you can see right there on the left side, in his speech he crossed out the word corona and replaces it Chinese. Chinese virus, China virus, Kung flu, Wuhan virus, to refer to coronavirus, has given the green light for racists, criminals on parole, and extremists of all shades to incite hate violence against Asian Americans. Words matter, especially when they are uttered by the President of the United States. After his usage of ethnic slur went viral, there was a surge in hate incidents ranging from verbal harassment, shunning, coughing at, spitting upon, to physical violence against Asian Americans. In the review of National Anti-Asian Hate Incident Reporting, published last week, it reveals that while the media coverage on anti-Asian hate crime tend to focus on violent crimes of Asian by Black Americans, in reality, more than 3/4 of offenders of anti-Asian hate crime and incident have been white. While anti-Asian hate incident made up only 7% of all the reported hate crimes in 2020, it is still useful to examine some of the horrific crimes committed against Asian Americans in 2021. And this will serve as a heuristic approach to better understand some of the common characteristics exhibited in these crimes and a sudden surge of violent crimes against Asian Americans this year. It is in this respect that I will briefly examine some of the more gruesome assaults in which the victims were either seriously injured or killed within the first 3 months of this year. The race of the victims and attacker will be noted as it is important for the ensuing discussion. For the sake of time, I will not cover every case listed here, but I will give you a gist of the case that I do not plan to cover. A warning that few of the slides contain vivid description of the violent acts. On January 28, Vicha Ratnapakdi, 84-year-old Thai man, died from injuries sustained after Antoine Watson, a 19-year-old black teenager, intentionally sprinted towards the victim and violently shoved him, knocking him to the ground, and afterward, without showing any remorse for what he had done or offering any assistance to the victim, as the suspect casually walked away from the scene. On January 31st, San Francisco Chinatown, a 91-year-old man who was later identified as Latino and not Asian was violently shoved to the ground by Yahya Muslim, a 28-year-old black assailant who had also attacked a 60-year-old man and 55-year-old woman on that same day. In both cases, hate crime was not charged because there was no tangible evidence that these men committed these crimes based on hatred toward Asian Americans. On February 3rd, Noah Quintana, a Filipino American, a religious man, boarded the subway in New York City on his way to work. He was praying the rosary on a crowded train when a deranged black man boarded the train at Bedford Station, targeted him at random, and slashed him across the face with a box cutter. In his interview with Eyewitness News ABC 7, Quintana said, "I was scared because I thought I was going to die, and nobody helped me." Not much information about the attacker is known. On March 11, Park Ho, a 75-year-old Asian man originally from Hong Kong, died from a traumatic head injury and brain damage incurred after Tiande Bailey, a 26-year-old black suspect with multiple prior felony conviction, robbed and assaulted him by shoving him to the ground. On March 15, a Filipino-Chinese man named Denny Yu Chan, a 59-year-old travel agent, was walking through San Francisco Financial District when an assailant punched his head from behind and knocked him unconscious to the ground. The Latino suspect, Jorge Davis Milton, who also stabbed a 64-year-old white man an hour earlier before attacking Chan, might not be charged with hate crime unless it can be proven that he made an incriminating remark about Chang's race. On March 16, Robert Aaron Long, a 21-year-old white assailant, went on a shooting spree and murdered 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women, at 3 massage spas in Atlanta area. While Long claimed that the shooting was not racially motivated and that he had sexual addiction problems, it was clear to many in the Asian American community that Long went into the Asian massage parlors to target members of their community. This tragic murder of 6 Asian women brought to the surface the notion of gender racism, the idea that racism experienced by Asian American women often has a sexual overtone. The 2018 report of the survey conducted by American Psychological Association asserts that the depiction of Asian women as quiet and invisible or a sex object has endured in American media and popular culture. For many Asian American women, hypersexualization, Asian women and misogyny are deeply intertwined and have often been led to violence. For them, the Atlanta massacre was not simply a sexual addiction problem of a white male suspect, but a stark reminder of how gender racism has dehumanized the bodies of 6 Asian women and brought about their tragic death. On March 29th, a vicious attack took place on a Midtown Manhattan sidewalk. On her way to church, a 65-year-old Filipina, she was probably Catholic going to Mass, she was kicked unprovoked by Brandon Elliott, a 38-year-old burly black man who was on lifetime parole after he was convicted of fatally stabbing his own mother in 2002. As an elderly Filipina, Vilma Kari, lay stunned on the sidewalk after receiving Elliott's kick to her stomach, he uttered a racial slur and he walked over to her and stomped on her head 3 different times. All the crimes mentioned above, this is the only one that has been officially declared as a hate crime. Many in the Asian American community, and perhaps those who saw the surveillance videos of these crimes, would consider all of them to be hate crimes. In the court of law, however, one has to prove beyond the reasonable doubt the motive of the person committing a violent crime did so on the basis of perceived or actual race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. For example, Elliot was charged with a hate crime in part because he made anti-Asian remarks during the assault, and he told her, "You do not belong here," or "You don't belong here." However, the 19-year-old Watson, who violently barreled into Ratanapakdi, is not charged with a hate crime because he did not say anything that would incriminate himself, even though his action killed a man. To be charged with a hate crime, the suspect must utter racial slur or has a history of a racist behavior. In other words, to say an incident is not a hate crime means that within a very narrow limit of the law, it could not be determined beyond a reasonable doubt that the perpetrator had a motivation to commit a crime based on bias. However, this does not mean that the incident was without hate or racism. The legal definition of hate crime in London massacre, for example, has not taken into account the fact that race crimes are usually intersectional crimes. That is to say, crimes against Asian women involve the intersection of race, gender, and violence. The examination of these violent crimes against Asian Americans in the first 3 months of 2021 reveals that many of these crimes are not categorized as a hate crime and therefore may not be racially motivated by the assailants. One of the commonality among the perpetrators is mental illness. All of them have to varying degrees of mental health problems. And having said this, we have to be careful not to stigmatize people with mental health problems. Studies have shown that the vast majority of people with mental illness are not violent people or dangerous criminals. Most offenders did not show patterns of crime related to symptoms of mental illness over their lifetime. Recent study on the link between mental illness and violent acts corroborates older findings that when people with serious mental illness commit violent crimes, other factors are often in play. Factors such as substance abuse, poverty, homelessness, as well as having been abused as a child, or environmental factors such as living in a high crime neighborhood. This is often the areas that both Black and Asian Americans can work together, as both communities are faced with inadequate resources to deal with mental health problems in their communities. Another thing to note about violent anti-Asian crimes in the first 3 months of this year is that while one perpetrator of violent crime was white, he killed more Asian Americans than all the other offenders of color combined. And if you include the month of April in the mix, there was a FedEx warehouse shooting where a 19-year-old white suspect killed 8 people, 4 of whom were Sikhs. This means that within the first 4 months of the year, 2 white persons killed 16 people, 10 of whom were Asian Americans. The media also influence how the American public see these violent crimes, and they tend to accentuate Black on Asian crimes that continue to pit these two communities. Because the media rarely mention the race of the assailant or include a photo of the attacker in their reporting, internet comments are filled with the assumption about the usual suspect, i.e. Black assailant. Asian American community organizers and activists warn that this sort of assumption plus ample video footage of Black men attacking Asian in the social media foster Black criminality and can lead to discriminatory policing that target Black and brown body at disproportionate rates. In other words, the fear is that depicting Blacks as villains can lead to tougher policing that can contribute to the criminalization of African Americans. And this sentiment is echoed by community organizer, activists, and many academics who caution against tougher policing, which can lead to discriminatory policing that target black and brown bodies at disproportionate rates. However, not everyone in the Asian American community is convinced that expanding policing is a bad thing for the community. Small shop owners in Chinatown pleaded for more police presence during the Chinese New Year. In general, store owners and senior citizens in Chinatown are in favor of greater police protection and presence in their neighborhood. Chris Kwok, board member of the Asian American Bar Association, echoed this view succinctly when he said, and I'm quoting him, "I certainly understand the desire not to unfairly criminalize African Americans and Latinos, but I think we also need to have accountability for these attacks." End quote. By accountability, he meant, among other things, if a community is under attack, it has the right to take appropriate actions to protect itself. So here I gave you both sides of the argument. One side wants police protection, the other side doesn't want a reliance on over-policing for fear that it will criminalize black and brown bodies. It's important to keep the distinction between individual violent crime from the deeper racism at the institutional and structural levels. Asian American scholars and community organizers and activists have maintained the source of both anti-Asian racism and anti-black racism is white supremacy. By white supremacy, they are not referring to racist terrorist group like the KKK, but rather to a system of domination that oppresses people of color. From this perspective, white supremacy is at the roots of all anti-Asian and anti-black racism. White supremacy constructed Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners and pitted Asian Americans against African Americans in particular. White supremacy also enabled the enslavement of African Americans, followed by institutional degradation, Jim Crow law, segregation, police brutality, and other forms of anti-blackness. Jennifer Ho, president of the Association of Asian American Studies and critical race scholar, puts it, and I'm quoting her, "The dehumanization of Asian people by U.S. society is driven by white supremacy and not by any black person who may or may not hate Asians," unquote. Now, Ho would say that it was white supremacy that was responsible for Elliot to attack Kari. Now, this sounds like a person of color can commit a crime, yet it's not their fault. This is not what she's saying. I think what she's saying is that the ideology of white supremacy is so pervasive that it's like the air that we breathe. It influences everything we do. We here mean both white and non-whites. In other words, we are not mere puppets passively conforming to the prescription of the ideology of white supremacy, even though we are all influenced by it. We are responsible for our own actions. Elliot was not without agency. He chose to regard Kari as the other and assaulted her without any provocation. For that, he was guilty of a hate crime. Colorism is the establishment of social hierarchy based on shades of skin tone within and between racialized communities. Colorism is prevalent not only in Asian American communities, but also African American, Latinx, and other communities of color. It's a form of discrimination based on skin tone, as lighter skinned people of color are preferred over darker skinned people of color in various social settings. In Asia, colorism predates colonialism. The saying that light-skinned individuals are more beautiful is a common expression in many Asian countries. In China and Japan, light-skinned individuals are associated with people of higher class as their jobs do not require them to toil in the sun. In her article, Yearning for Lightness, Evelyn Nagano-Glenn points out that the association of physical attractiveness with light skin is especially critical for many Asian women, and the search for this unchangeable capital takes the form of using cosmetics or other treatments to change the appearance of one's skin to make it look lighter. The demands for skin lightening creams in the global markets was estimated to be $8.6 billion last year. The preference for lighter skinned individual reinforces whiteness and so contribute to anti-blackness. Colorism is deeply ingrained within many Asian culture. It is something that Asian Americans have to reckon with if they are to undergo or if they are to undo the legacy of anti-blackness within their own communities. In other words, deconstructing anti-blackness is tied to deconstructing colorism. A brief theological reflection. The Bishop Pastoral Letter Open Wide Our Hearts emphasizes that, I'm reading from the screen here, racist acts are sinful because they violate justice. They reveal a failure to acknowledge the human dignity of the person offended, to recognize them as their neighbor Christ called them to love. Racism is a sin, as a sin is a failure to recognize people from all identities and walks of life as brothers and sisters, which is essential to respecting the dignity of another human person. Seeing a person who is different from us as the other conveys a mental and moral power that makes violence possible. One of the most distressing aspects of anti-Asian hate violence operating in our society today is that most of the victims have been elderly and women, and they were devalued for their otherness and treated by their attackers as less than human. And this was unmistakably demonstrated in a shocking attack of a 65-year-old Filipina that took place in New York on March 29. The suspect earlier treated Kari, a Filipino mother, like a virus by kicking her unprovoked and stomping on her multiple times. Though he had never been a slave himself, Elliot had internalized the white supremacist idea that dates back to the time of slavery by treating another human being as less than human. To the assault to the injury, the entire incident took place in front of the building, witnessed by a security guard of the building, who not only failed to render support, but he actually closed the glass door of the building. Had he not wanted to get physically involved, the security guard could have opened the door and yelled at the suspect, who was less than a stone throw away from him. Instead, he callously closed the glass door of the building on her. Unfortunately, this scenario is repeated elsewhere across the country. Attackers who have no morals or human decency, and bystanders who remain silent and said or did nothing, and thereby becoming complicit with the crime, occurs on a regular basis in the United States today. Perhaps this presages a gradual dissolution of a society, a disintegration of the traditional respect for the dignity of the human person codified in Judeo-Christian tradition. This is what happened when the signposts of human decency or ethics have eroded to the extent that we are left with a country full of coward criminals who target the most vulnerable and gutless bystander who remain silent in times of crisis. To be fair, most bystanders probably don't know what to do. That's why they remain silent. So it's important to take bystander training to know what to do without putting yourself at risk. Out of this gruesome story, however, come a story of absolution. Of all the victims mentioned above, Noor Quintana stood out as someone who was able to do something godlike that most would rebel at the thought of doing. That is, he was able to forgive the man who slashed his face with a box cutter. In an interview that was replayed in the Rel and DOTV video in which the interviewer asked Quintana, "Do you think you can forgive him for what he did?" To which Quintana replied, "Oh yes, everybody deserves to have forgiveness." Now I couldn't find this in any of the print media, but I could find in every print media the story of him being slashed across his face with a box cutter. But Quintana forgiving the man who slashed his face, I could not find it. I saw it in this interview, so I know he said that he forgive the guy. And this tells you something about our culture, our media. Now, what is important to them? And the idea of forgiveness is not important enough to report. Quintana lives out one of the most unpalatable of Jesus' directive: to love our enemies as God loves us, even those who hate God. Perhaps what enabled Quintana to forgive his attacker was that he does not allow himself to be identified with the hurts of being a victim of violent crime, even though the scar across his face is a reminder of that horrific crime every time he looks into the mirror. In other words, Quintana does not allow what happened to him to become a defining point in his understanding of who he is. This is something that Eliot and other assailants are unable to do. They are unable to move on to healthy anger about what happened to them. They wallow in their hurts and pains and allow them to define who they are. If you allow your hurts and pain to define who they are, they'll have a life of their own. In the Christian tradition, people who are able to do what Quintana has done are considered holy people. That's all I'm going to say today. So I see you all on June 23rd.